Hi everybody, welcome to this webinar organised by the Hong Kong International Arbitration Centre, the HKIAC, focusing today on cybersecurity and domain name misuse. A huge thank you to all of you for making some time to hear from us this afternoon, and we hope you find the session fruitful. I'm Kieran Sanghera, Special Counsel at the HKIAC, and I lead the domain name dispute resolution team here. So the title of today's webinar is Ask the Experts, Cybersecurity and Domain Name Abuse. And this is a very apt title when we take into account the speakers that we have with us today, all of whom are true experts in the field of cybersecurity, investigations, brand protection, and domain name dispute resolution. So we have here, and feel free to give a wave, David Franklin, who's the Global Director of Brand Protection at CSE, a leading global provider of corporate domain management and online brand protection services. David's been with CSE for 13 years and is responsible for CSE's brand protection in Europe as well as the Asia Pacific region. And his main focus is to help clients with services and strategies to detect and remove online threats. We also have with us today Paul Jackson. Hi, Paul. Paul is the APAC Regional Managing Director for Kroll's Cyber Risk Practice. Paul started his career with the Hong Kong Police Force in the 80s. Very interesting fact and very useful for today's conversation. He's also the founder and leader of the first technology crime division within the Hong Kong Police Force. He's led trainings on behalf of Interpol throughout the region. And Paul was also global head of cyber investigations for JP Morgan in New York before he returned to Hong Kong for his role at Kroll 4 years ago. And last but absolutely by no means least, we have Charmaine. Hi, Charmaine. Charmaine Koo is the co-head of the Intellectual Property Department of Deakins, and one of the largest, or in fact the largest IP legal practice in Hong Kong. She's also extremely experienced with over 25 years of experience helping clients with IP infringement and enforcement strategies and actions encompassing a combination of administrative actions, court proceedings, and arbitrations. And importantly, Charmaine has handled and won numerous leading IP court and arbitration cases here in Hong Kong. So, a huge thank you to our experts for finding the time to join us today and to share their wealth of knowledge. We're very thankful on behalf of HKIAC. So in the next hour, we'll take a look back at some of the major cybersecurity threats in 2020, and our experts will be discussing the key strategies that businesses can adopt to protect themselves from what has been an increase in cyber attacks. Before we get to the panel discussion, I'll give a brief overview of the role domain name dispute resolution can play, specifically as a measure that companies can take to counter domain name misuse, and also share a little bit of HKIAC's experience. We'll then move into the main session, which will be a panel discussion between our three experts, which I have no doubt will be engaging and interactive. So with that, I'll just take a few moments of your time to take a look at, with a bit more detail, what domain name dispute resolution is in the context of domain name misuse. So I'm going to start by taking a step back and look at how domain name dispute resolution can assist with brand protection and also tackle domain name misuse. And I'll share some general details for those of you who might be less familiar with the process as to what domain name dispute resolution is and the perceived benefits. So why, we could just go to the first slide. Perfect, thank you. I guess maybe something that many of you are already aware of, but it's really crucial to dispute the ownership of a domain name in order to protect the integrity of your brand. So if a domain name is identical or confusingly similar to your trademark, and it's being operated by someone who's not authorized to do so, this could, and often does, lead to consumers thinking that the website might belong to you or your business, and this can negatively impact your brand. So disputing the ownership of a domain name can tackle also various domain name misuses, which are listed here in box 1. and that can result in the transfer or the cancellation of the domain name, and therefore effectively helping to put an end to the misuse. So I've listed a couple of examples here in box 1. So what we're looking at really is domain names that are registered for the purpose of creating fraudulent or counterfeit websites. And there are a few tactics that are used, which are also listed here, such as phishing. And I've certainly seen a number of these in my personal emails, which is effectively using disguised emails for the purposes of obtaining sensitive information. Credential theft, often via email phishing, or by completion of online forms on a website, again, for the purpose of obtaining sensitive information, such as names, addresses, banking information. And then also malware distribution, something that we've also seen on our cases. So this really involves viruses, ransomware, spyware, designed to cause damage to data, to systems, or to gain access to a network which is unauthorized. This can be done again through phishing emails, for example, or where individuals download attachments to those phishing emails. So that's the sort of world of, in very simple terms, what we're seeing in terms of domain name misuse. And why it's important, therefore, when that's happening, to dispute the ownership of the domain name. So who can do that? Effectively, anyone who wants to protect their rights in relation to a domain name. So that's often, this is what we see, the owner or licensee of a registered trademark. And that claim will be filed against the domain name registrant, the person effectively, or the entity that's engaged in the domain name misuse in the context of today's webinar. Procedures that are available, they vary depending on the domain name category that is involved. So, and this is where many of the abbreviations and acronyms come in. So I'll try and keep them as short and simplistic as possible. But traditional generic top-level domains such as .com, .net, .org, country or place-specific top-level domains, so .cn, .hk, for example, as well as new generic top-level domains. They have different policies that apply to disputes that arise in relation to them. The policies are generally the same, but it's important to note that there's a different policy depending on the category of domain name. And who decides the outcome of the dispute? Well, that's the domain name panelist. And the important role that an institution like ours plays is to appoint that domain name panelists to ensure they're independent, neutral, and capable. On some occasions, it's a 3-member panel, but most often it's a sole panelist. What are the possible results? So as I mentioned, transferring the domain name is common back to the complainant, cancelling the domain name altogether, and where a complainant is not successful, the complaint will be rejected. The registrar will then implement the decision if in relation to a transfer or a cancellation. Next slide, please. Key features, I will whiz through these, but just for those to compare with other dispute resolution options such as arbitration and litigation, DNDR, domain name dispute resolution, is a simple, effective and transparent procedure. So paper-based, usually no hearings. Lawyers' involvement is optional, but Charmaine, I'm sure, and we certainly have seen the very effective use of lawyers when they do file complaints and participate. There's always 3 key elements to prove, and they're the same for each case under that specific policy. And even between policies, there are very small differences. So it's a fairly uniform process to follow in terms of the points you need to prove. High success rate for complainants, and I think this mustn't be understated. In our cases, over 96% of the cases result in the domain name being transferred or cancelled. And decisions are available publicly. So you're able to see how decisions have been handled by panelists in the past. It's fairly quick and cost efficient. So flat fee, which always makes users feel more comfortable, and a fairly quick time frame. So usually decisions are made within 60 days of the commencement of the proceedings. Next slide, please. Just a slide here to let you know where we fit in the grand scheme of things at HKIAC. So the bottom box is us that you can see, and we are a member, so I'm going backwards here. We are a member of the AD&DRC, the Asian Domain Name Dispute Resolution Centre, the middle row, the orange box, and we're the Hong Kong office. And the AD&DRC is one of the 6 accredited UDRP service providers, which means we are one of the 6 institutions globally that can handle disputes arising under that policy, which are effectively generic top-level domains and certain country code top-level domains. So .com, for example. And we were the founding member of the AD&DRC. Next slide, please. It's a problem that I'm struggling to say next slide, please, isn't it today? But I will do my best. So in terms of what we offer, I've just mentioned AD&DRC. So we handle UDRP and the other policy disputes under the other policies listed there. By far, the majority of cases are under the UDRP. And then we also are able to handle disputes arising under certain country-specific policies. And as you can see there, as they relate to .hk, .cn, and .ph. Next slide, please. To give you a bit of a flavour of what we're seeing in our cases, by far we see more matters being filed under the UDRP. So again, generic top-level domains such as .com, .net, .org. But also we're seeing cases that involve .cn and .hk, as you can see from the pie chart on the left. We have a broad jurisdictional base in terms of where the parties are coming from. So you've got the top 10 listed there in the middle. We have mainland China and Hong Kong, as well as other Asian jurisdictions such as Taiwan, Singapore, and Japan. But actually, we see a lot of US, as you can see, top 3 listed there, and as well as other European parties involved in our cases. You'll see there on the right, there's a bit of variation between the complainant jurisdictions and respondent jurisdictions in terms of numbers. So mainland China as a complainant filed 41 cases. As respondent, they were involved in cases 98 times, and you can see the same for the US. So certainly by far, mainland and US seem to feature quite frequently as complainant and respondent. Okay, next slide, please. I mentioned the outcomes. I think this is really one of the benefits of domain name dispute resolution. So of the 139 decisions rendered in our 2020 caseload, 134 of those resulted in the transfer of the domain name. So there really is a high success rate. And you can see the breakdown here by policy. So in 96% of the cases under the UDRP, so generic top-level domains, for example, the domain name was transferred to the complainant. In 2 cases, the complaint was denied, and in 2 cases, the proceedings were terminated. So maybe that settlement was achieved, for example. CNDRP.cn, 100% of those decisions resulted in a transfer of the domain name. And there, 86% of the domain names were, 6 of the 7 cases, a transfer resulted in a transfer. And in 1 matter, the domain name was cancelled at the request of the complainant. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to conclude here, which I think hopefully will set the scene a little bit for the panel discussion, is just to give you a bit of a flavour of what we see specific to domain name dispute resolution involving domain name misuse. For example, phishing, credential theft, and malware distribution. I've taken a sample of the cases that have been filed under the Uniform Dispute Resolution Policy over the last couple of years. And you can see there that the sectors that have been involved have been quite varied. So finance, a couple of cases involving financial institutions. And as you might imagine, the misuse there was trying to obtain personal banking information. Internet and IT, so that was through social media platforms, professional services, retail, and telecommunications. So it's an area that can, domain name misuse can touch on a variety of different sectors. You won't be surprised to know, but hopefully reassured to know, where domain name misuse is established, there's a 100% success rate for the complainants, and the domain names were transferred in all of the cases where these issues arose to the complainant. A couple of takeaways, and I suppose some fairly basic examples, but for those who are less familiar with the terminology, just to plant the seed of what this might mean, or what the examples of misuse. So what we've seen is that the domain name used have been used to send fraudulent emails to clients of a complainant by impersonating the complainant, again, to obtain personal and financial information. A domain name that has redirected users to a website that effectively copies and duplicates the complainant's website, logo, colors, fonts, again, to get users to complete an online form for personal and sensitive information. We saw an example of false invoices being created using the complainant software, emails, phishing emails associated with the domain name being sent, and once the invoice was opened, the malware was downloaded. And I think we'll talk about this further, but domain names are not necessarily connected to active websites, but the emails, the phishing emails, for example, are associated with those domain names. What I will do is pause here, and I hope I've been able to give you, I suppose, what's a flavour of what we do and see, but also an introduction to what domain name misuse is and why it's important to tackle it. We will move into the panel discussion, and I do want to encourage everybody who is watching and listening to us today to look at the bottom of their screens where they will find a Q&A icon, and to type in freely at any time any questions that you have. We really want this to be as interactive and as helpful to you as possible. So enter into your questions, and I'm sure our panelists will address them to the extent possible throughout the discussion. You may be pleased to hear that I will now be handing over to David, Charmaine, and Paul, and to thank David in particular for moderating this session, and also for providing a bit of a scene-setting presentation on a more broader global trends perspective. So I will hand over to you, David, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kieran, and some very useful information there. So as Kieran mentioned, I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so setting the scene with some statistics, with some trends, some strategies on what you can do to combat some of the cybersecurity threats, the fraud that Kieran was mentioning earlier, and some of the things that I'm going to cover, some of the threat vectors and trends we're seeing. So if we can share the slides again, please, Chloe. Thank you. So yes, and we're going to be talking about some of the things we've seen over the last year, especially as it relates to the global pandemic. So if we have the next slide, please, Chloe. So CSC did a study on how the COVID-19 crisis has affected online content, and so I'm going to cover sort of four broad areas: the coronavirus related domain names and what we've seen in terms of registrations. I'm going to sort of touch on some of the things that Kieran's also mentioned: phishing, fraud, and malware, but just very briefly. We're also going to look at what we've seen on social media and on online marketplaces, and at the end there'll be a couple of recommendations. So after my sort of 10 minutes of scene setting, we're going to have about a 30-minute panel discussion, and certainly people like Paul and Charmaine be able to help you with some of the strategies as well that you can take away and use in your own area. Okay, let's move on. So registration dates for domains with keywords. So what we're seeing here is an interesting sort of development of how domain name registration has mirrored the global events of the pandemic. So we see certain events, and then we see a large number of domain registrations mirroring that. So things like tests, and then vaccines, and then announcement of particular strains like COVID-19. So we can see sort of the domain name registration world mirroring what's going on. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see how that translates into the number of registered domains. This might be quite a surprise to many of you, but we're talking about tens of thousands of domain registrations with COVID and with coronavirus in the domain name. Some have neutral content, Some have keywords, and many, I'm sure, will be used for fraudulent purposes. So on the right hand side there, you'll see various different treatment related keywords, tracking, e-commerce related keywords. So there's a subset which are probably more important to general security, so 7,000. If we go to the next slide, what we've done is we've sort of handpicked some of the ones which are getting a lot more daily visitors. So these are some of the page titles and related sites. And you can see it's no surprise that some of them are selling masks, some of them are selling tracking. So that's what we've seen in terms of domain registrations. And essentially, people are looking to make money either through domain squatting or through fraudulent purposes. And we'll see some of the trends in a minute. So next slide, please. So phishing is one of the things that has really increased during the pandemic. So from 2019 to 2020, there was a 100% increase in phishing, and it continues to increase to 2021. We don't have the stats yet, but I imagine it's still going up. And what we're seeing is the scams are using trusted organizations, the World Health Organization, other trusted organizations to try and get payments. And we'll see a couple of examples on the next slide of how those organizations are using. So they might be registering the domains like we saw earlier without necessarily having any content on the website, but just using that for sending emails. And they're using things like classic hooks or and a lot of governments are offering payments to people while they're out of work, and so they're using that kind of threat vector. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see a couple of examples. So here we have sort of entering in your postcode to calculate a refund, business continuity advice, and all of these are either going to take your details and then use that for fraudulent purposes, or maybe load malware onto your machine. So if we go to the next slide, we're also seeing it via social media as well. And social media as a channel for fraudulent and also counterfeit distribution is growing faster than other channels. It's still not where we are with marketplaces and websites, but it's growing very quickly, and we're seeing distribution of phishing content via social media growing very quickly. We're seeing also a lot of donation scams, and you probably were aware of the very high-profile Twitter donation scam involving some of the celebrities. It was only up for about 30 minutes, and this was about a year or so ago. But also, we're seeing references to brands in conjunction with misinformation. So especially where you've got things like anti-vaccination groups and links between sort of 5G conspiracy theories and COVID. And if your brand's involved in that, for instance, if you happen to be one of the mobile phone technology companies or in any way involved, that could have a severe impact on your reputation. So it's worth keeping in mind. So next slide, please. Mobile apps. We're also seeing a trend in mobile apps incorporating malicious content. So here's a few examples. There was Corona Live 1.1 that was a coronavirus tracker, but it actually created malware on your phone. And there's a COVID lock, and that was also had a lot of malicious content. So I mean, most of these non-legitimate apps tend to be on standalone APK sites, so they might not necessarily be on Google Play or Apple phone. They might be on some of the less well-known sites, for instance, I know AppZoom and Aptoid and those sort of sites. So it's really important to make sure that if you're trying to protect your brand, that you're monitoring across a wide range of different mobile app download sites. And we even found some Iranian spyware passing off as a symptom tracker. So that's some of the trends that we've seen over the last year or so. Okay, next slide, please. So when it comes to marketplaces, online marketplaces, there may be many people on this call that have brands which are impacted by counterfeits. And one of the things that perhaps is no surprise, but is that over the last year or so, there has been a quite significant growth in fake products sold online as a percentage. So if you look at this graph, you can see it's gone from about, this is showing the percentage of fake goods versus genuine goods that are authenticated via a CertiLogo application. So CertiLogo provides smart labels which allow consumers to verify whether a brand is genuine or not. So it went from about 19% to 20%, 27% of all the authentications were fake goods. So it shows you that what we're seeing is users buying online are more likely to be buying a fake goods over the last year or so, and I think that's probably as a reflection of the fact that commerce has moved massively online over the last year or so as well. Okay, next slide, please. And of course, it's no surprise that you see counterfeit tests. This one's on Alibaba. Next slide. You will also see fake branded masks as well. Next slide, please. So if you have a brand, one of the things that you should really look out for is anyone selling any kind of branded masks, because that seems to be quite a common thing. If you're not monitoring Redbubble is a site which does a lot of branded goods to customized branded goods. That's one where you see a lot of masks. So that's a tip for those of you on the call. So here are some sort of popular hotspot marketplaces we would recommend that you monitor. These are the ones where we see predominantly a much higher percentage of counterfeits being sold. Okay, next slide, please. So what can you do about it? So just to wrap up, I'll give you a couple of hints. So generally the strategy that we would recommend is to perhaps partner with a company like CSC, a service provider that has already built up all the experience and relationships with the different third parties for fast, successful enforcement. You can do it yourself, but it takes a long time to build up the know-how on how to contact the various marketplaces, social media sites, mobile app sites, and to know what strategy or what route to take for any particular given infringement. So that's something that we've built up over the last 20 years. And these are the sort of typical takedown durations and success rates you can achieve once you've built up that knowledge and that know-how. And you can see there's UDRPs, which is what Kieran was referring to earlier. Generally tends to take a bit longer, but it does have a place for particular kinds of infringement. And we'll see later on with Paul and also with Charmaine on some of the domain issues and what they've been able to help their clients with. So let's go to the next slide. So the other part of the strategy we would recommend is, as well as partnering with a company to do fast takedowns, is also then to focus in on who are the biggest infringers. So use some kind of technology to cluster and to focus on who are the big fish. And if you go to the next slide, and if you can build that one out, using a way of joining the dots from the online world to the offline world to find out where a particular infringer might be located. And in this case, the starting point was the top left, an infringing website. We traced this particular infringer through to associated social media pages, but actually found where they were physically located through some historical cached whois details on that website, which led us to the actual location. So that's our suggestion. Sort of two-pronged strategy. Find and take down the infringements as quickly as possible, but also then focus on who are the people, the ringleaders behind the networks of infringement. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to the panel discussion. So if you can stop sharing the slides, Chloe. And I think, and again, I do encourage people to ask questions, and if you guide us with the questions that you'd like answered, then we can make sure that the panel discussion is most relevant to what you'd like to know about. But I'm going to pass it over to Paul, who has a wealth of experience and who has a case study on domain name abuse that he would like to share, where it led to breaches, fraud, and data loss, and then understand what's behind the criminal's motivation as well. So, Paul, over to you. And I think we've got a couple of quick questions in here, which is good.
Yeah, we do.
So I'll have a monitor of those while you're telling us about your case study, Paul.
No problem. I'll talk to you a little bit about what we're seeing at Kroll. But yeah, love the questions. Thanks for the questions on the Peloton bike. That was kind of predictable, but thank you for that. But now we're getting some real questions coming in. So yeah, if you can sort those out, David, while I just give a quick perspective from the Kroll side. So Kroll, for those of you who don't know us, we're an investigations company effectively. So we do around 2,500 incidents, deal with 2,500 incidents globally every year. So we're seeing we have a huge amount of visibility into the trends that the organized crime groups, etc., are using to attack organizations' IT infrastructure. I've just taken notes from our recent trends report, which we update that every month. So for the last month, we noted that manufacturing and healthcare were the two industries most targeted, but not far behind that. They were neck and neck, but not far behind that was professional services, and the bulk of the professional services being attacked was law firms. So sorry, Charmaine, but anyway, but the tactic used in the vast majority of these cases, or at least to initiate the breach, was via phishing. So obviously that's been touched on already. We saw a 7% increase from March to April in phishing attacks, and in the case of the manufacturing industry, the target is generally ransomware, or the outcome. The objective, I should say, is to affect them with ransomware, whereas the healthcare and the professional services, the top attack vector was to go after email. In other words, to compromise email, especially web cloud-based email accounts. We're talking about Office 365, Google, Gmail suites, etc. And I think, as Kieran mentioned, domain names are being set up, not really for the website purposes, but more for those email impersonation purposes. And we're seeing a huge rise in this. So just to walk you through how we do an investigation. So when we get called in to do an incident where there's been a breach, the typical flow is that obviously a company's in distress. We want to get visibility across their networks. We want to understand the threat and to eliminate the threat so the business can resume their activities, their business activities. But then on, it's actually trying to work out the attack vector and work out what the attackers did from that point. And in almost every case, it's linked to domain name abuse. It's linked to phishing, and it's linked to impersonation. The bad guys are very clever. They do their homework. They work out the best ways of social engineering or tricking. David touched on a few topical ones, especially around COVID related phishing attacks. But in our world, what we're seeing is these are less about the frauds, but more about the attempts to gain access into corporate networks, to steal corporate information, or to inflict ransomware on them. These are the vast majority of our cases currently, and it's what we are seeing. So we recently, information from the NCFTA, which is the National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance in the US, who work with the FBI on domain name impersonations, showed that actually business email compromise is on the up, and we're seeing that as well. So it's still on the up. It's risen during 2020 and in 2021, and that's from their records, from the reports that they've received, 7% now of private and public companies have had domains impersonated now. And malicious activity peaked in 2016, but it's been rising again in 2020. But the targets have been shifting. The domains, they're now looking at impersonating domains that look like they're official, but linked to like SharePoint, Microsoft Office, Office 365, Google Drive, etc. So they're creating domain names that are looking like a company name with a subdomain of SharePoint, for example, making it look legitimate. So you know, because we're increasingly in the corporate world used to working in SharePoint and the cloud with our office environment. So when people see those kind of URLs or domain names, they kind of it kind of looks real to them. You know, and as David already said, the COVID-19 has led to increased government and healthcare impersonations, and there's been a surge in what we call VIDNs. So VIDNs are really visual impersonation of domain names. So slightly altering the domain names visually, where to trick the eye into believing they are real domain names. Four examples of visual impersonation include typo squatting, in other words, just adding you know, just letters or dots, making it similar to a company's real domain, putting an extra full stop in there, you know, doppelganger domains which are resembling legitimate but not owned by the victim company, or cousin domains. So as I mentioned, you know, like something like added onto the front, like humanresources-company.com. So it makes it look legitimate, even though it doesn't actually belong to the company.
And that's an interesting point, Paul, because we've had a question come through that somebody has written in saying they've noticed some domain names of law firms are made to look like real law firms, and what can the law firm do in those circumstances? So I know that your focus is more kind of on investigation. I don't know if Charmaine's got anything that she can answer in terms of what a law firm could do. I could also add some further comment as well, because it is something we have, as you mentioned, Paul, we have seen a trend that law firms over the last year or two have been more and more impacted by sort of impersonation cases, whether it's executives or whether it's the company name, etc. So Charmaine, have you got and we'll come back to you in a minute, Paul, a sort of point on that at all?
Oh, definitely. It's actually quite interesting because I've seen quite a number of fake law firm websites. And in fact, my name is in one of them, together with some of my partners and a combination of partners from different law firms. So it's actually quite interesting who they decided to pick for what. And obviously, they didn't use my picture. They used, I don't know, some celebrities' pictures, and it's a mix and match kind of thing. It's actually quite interesting because one of the cases that we saw was that when a law firm, like two law firms were about to merge, so someone obviously got wind of that. So that what they did was to go and register the new merged name before the law firm actually merged. So it, you know, as I would talk about a little bit later in my, you know, in my part, that sometimes is very difficult because when someone registers a domain name before the owner actually starts using the domain name, it actually makes it harder to file these complaint procedures. So obviously, the easy way is that when someone impersonates an established law firm is to file a complaint, because if you've got a registered trademark, most law firms should, or if you've been using the mark for a long time and there's misrepresentation, then you can file a complaint, and it shouldn't be too difficult to get it back. The more difficult situations would be like what I said, when the name hasn't actually been established and then someone registered it first.
Yeah, thank you, Charmaine. And of course, if you could also go down the takedown route rather than, if you didn't necessarily want to acquire that particular domain name, you could go down the takedown route. And if you've got trademark rights, you could either claim it on the basis of trademark infringement or impersonation or fraud or copyright infringement. So there's a number of different routes that you could take to take that down.
Sorry,
quick question.
Some companies.
Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, I was just going to say, some companies also alert, you know, their clients and customers, etc., to the existence of these domains in the interim, because obviously awareness is key. It can take some time to take down or to eliminate these. So you know, there's always reminders are good to, you know, the legitimate domain names to clients, and just to ask them to be on alert.
Yeah.
No, that's a very good point, Paul. And we would strongly recommend, if you're not already using a service which allows you to get sort of early warning of any new registration. So for instance, CSC provides a service which monitors all the domain name zone files as soon as they're published every day with all the new registrations, and then we analyze them to see what content is in the domain name and whether it relates to your brand or not, and then provide a sort of score as to whether it's highly likely to be infringing or moderate, etc. So if you have that early warning, then you can take action before any damage is done. Good point, Paul. So just before we go to Charmaine, I know she's got an interesting case study on an attack on a financial institution that we wanted to cover. But we had a question, Paul, about your report. Would it be available online? Are we going to share that with attendees, or can we share it with attendees?
It's not available online. It's kind of internal and with clients. But please reach out to me. I mean, we're easy to find on LinkedIn, etc. Please reach out to me. I'm sure it can be arranged. But parts of the report have got some sensitive information in, so it would have to be redacted a little bit.
Yes, okay. And on that point, actually, I believe that the Arbitration Centre is going to share our email addresses after this webinar, so that you can contact us if you have any specific questions for any of us, and we will be making a recording of the webinar available as well. So with that, I'm going to pass over to you, Charmaine, and perhaps Chloe, if you can bring up the handful of slides that Charmaine has.
Sure. I think I agree with what you've all said before, and thank you for setting the scene. I think what we definitely see nowadays is that fraudsters are becoming more and more sophisticated. Years ago, when I first started out, it's quite straightforward. You see someone register a domain name with a famous brand as part of the domain, and then they'll have a fake website. We've done a lot of cases for financial institutions as well as brands, and it's very easy to spot them and then to do something about it and take it down. So cases that we've seen recently have become more and more sophisticated. So like what Kieran and David, you just mentioned, very often fraudsters register the domain name, but they don't actually use the domain name as a website. So it's not that easy to spot anymore. What they do is they use the domain name as part of their emails and then approach people that way, because it's much more subtle and it's not as easy to track because it's not a public website. So one of the cases that we literally just did in the last 2 months is for a financial institution. So I've changed the name of the client, so obviously to protect their privacy, but other information is actually real. So to make it more clear, I've set out the details here. So basically, our client is a financial institution. Obviously, they provide a lot of financial products, etc. So they've recently received some inquiries and complaints from customers saying that, hey, we've invested money in your products. So is this really you, or what's going on? We've received emails from you. And then the client then looked into a little bit, and then they contacted us, and we found out that, how did these customers start receiving emails from our client? It's because they went on a supposedly very neutral website, which helps people compare different financial products. So the website is called compareinvestment.com.au. So it looks very innocent. The website, you just go on and it helps you determine what's your criteria, what's your risk level, what type of products you're interested in. And then you enter in some information about yourself, and then they will apparently contact all the well-known financial institutions, and they will contact you. So these customers basically went onto this website, and then they, literally, they're just trying to find information about different products and compare their rates and compare the returns, etc. And they filled in the form. And then the next thing they know is that they received emails purportedly from our clients. So next slide, please. So after they filled in their information on this innocent looking, neutral website, then they received emails purporting to come from our clients' staff. So they received email from info from ABC Bank, which is our client, and then also from individuals from our client's bank, John Smith. So John Smith is actually a real person. He's actually the head of legal and compliance. So you can imagine that he was extremely upset that people actually use his name to send emails to these prospective investors. So everything looked very legitimate, and the customers then, corresponded with these emails, and then there was a website. Next slide, please. So the email looked really legitimate, as I'm sure we've all seen. It uses the bank's trademark. It puts a link to the actual website of the real bank. And then it's got the real address, company registration, and then they send over prospectuses, which are really of the bank, except that they've changed some of the contact details. So the only thing that's not real is the phone number that you're supposed to contact, which is obviously the fraudsters, because that's how they communicate with you, and then the email address. And so from then, they ask for contacts, and then the client's, prospective customers then invested. And the bank actually received 17 customer complaints, and they've lost over $2.4 million. So they've actually invested through this scam. So next slide, please. Yep, so through investigation, we found that there are actually 2 domain names registered with our clients' trademark. So abcbank-au and abc-aus. As we now know, if you try to do a whois search to see who owns the website of the domain name, it's often rejected. The only thing we can see that it is the address is based in Hong Kong and the domain name registrar is in Hong Kong. The websites themselves are not actually used. So, if you go on the domain name, you can't actually find any website. So it is interesting, as I said, as opposed to previously where they actually put forth a fake website and you can easily see them. Now they don't even use the website. They only use the domains for the fake emails. So it's part of the emails. So for our clients, basically, we immediately wanted to do something about it, how to shut it down. So looking at these domain names, obviously, as we all know, if the domain name consists of a famous brand, then you can do the UDRP procedure. You can file a complaint to have the name transferred or taken down, but that does take a little while, as we've seen just now. So we then, so we did do that. And in fact, we very successfully obtained a transfer of the domain names back to the client, but that actually took about a month and a half or so. It's not that long, but at the same time, the clients did absolutely need to do something quicker than just file UDRP. So we looked into all sorts of different things, which we always do, because I think it always has to be a combination of different actions. UDRP is definitely useful, but there are other things that you can do, which I think David and Paul have already mentioned. So what we did was we identified the registrar. So we tried to file a complaint with the registrar, but they ignored us. We did a lot of searches using the server and IP address, and we found the ISPs that were hosting the domain names. And there were a number of ISPs. Some of them are more legitimate and more, larger operations than others. So we basically identified the best ISP to file complaints with because they have actually got proper notice takedown procedures. And then we filed a complaint with the ISP. Obviously, we needed to explain to them and gather evidence to show all the different things that they're doing, because the website, the domain names themselves doesn't actually resolve to any website. So it's not that easy to see what they were doing. We were, again, very successful. So the day that we filed the complaint, the ISP immediately suspended the website and the domain. So no more emails can be sent from that domain name anymore. Then we also then need to deal with the comparison website. So the comparison website is harder because, as you may recall, the website itself doesn't use any brand names. It's just, it's just a generic name. So you can't actually file a domain name dispute resolution, complaint against them because they didn't use anyone's trademarks. So we then had to, create an account to approach them to see whether they'll, respond to us. So we actually went on and put our names down as prospective investors to see whether anyone sent us emails. So there was nothing coming from that. What we did then is we did a whois search. So the interesting thing is, again, we noticed that this time the information was not redacted. If we can have the slides back, please. Yes, so when we did the domain name whois search, you can see that the registrant is actually not redacted. It's a company called AKD Buildings Limited. And then there's actually a contact name called Andrew Dodd. And the registrar for the domain name is an Australian company, which is quite, it's quite well regarded. So what we did was we then did a lot of searches about this company, and we realized that this is a real company, but they're in the business of building and construction. So we thought that it was actually a little bit strange, right? So we then wrote to the registrant through his email and on a pretext to ask them, to find out whether they're linked to the compare site. And then the registrant actually wrote back and say, it's not as someone has used my name fraudulently as the registrant as the contact details. So on this basis, we were able to file a complaint with the registrar as well. And then the registrar then again suspended the website. So it is actually a quite interesting case because, as I said, everything is so complicated, and the fraudsters are using more and more sophisticated means to defraud people, and it's no longer that straightforward. I think I saw a question just now as well that some people asked whether you can report to the police. So obviously we did all of that as well, because I think when you have a situation like this, you really need to attack it from all sides and do everything that you can to see which one works, because they are obviously hard to track down. They use a lot of fake information. So some things might work and some things won't work. And sometimes when you file a complaint with an ISP, they might not respond to you. So you need to really identify all the different ISPs involved and then try to identify ones that are more likely to respond to you as well. So we did file complaints with the police. We filed complaints with the SFCs, with the regulators. As most of us who deal with regulators know, sometimes it does take them a long time to do something. So in the end, we basically worked with them, and then we agreed that we will file the complaints directly with the registrars, and they were able to take action more quickly.
That's really insightful, Charmaine. In fact, it's quite relevant because we've had a question in about what somebody's encountered an issue with an ISP of a domain being changed rapidly to avoid tracking. And sort of following on from what you've said about tracing through and finding out the registration details, if people are encountering sort of rapidly changing ISPs, which is a tactic used by fraudsters,
yeah,
we would strongly recommend zeroing in on the registrar and looking to get the takedown of the domain at the registrar level rather than focusing on the ISP and the content. We tend to find that that's a more permanent takedown because it's getting rid of the use of the name completely.
exactly.
Now, in your case, Charmaine, they didn't redact the who is details. Sometimes you find it's redacted for privacy, sometimes not. So different organizations have different strategies, but as a registrar, CSC is able to go to these other registrars and say, we have reason to believe it's being used for fraudulent purposes. You need to reveal the ownership details, and that usually happens. And just as just as Charmaine's mentioned, you often find that people's real registrations or real addresses are being used. So, for instance, if people buy counterfeit goods online, they might get the counterfeit goods, and they might feel that's the end of it, and then maybe they've got a fake branded handbag. But actually what they don't know is that their address details that were used for the shipping are then going to be used for registration of a fake and fraudulent domain. So yeah, just do be aware. And on that subject, Russia was another question that came up. And we would recommend for Russia taking either a registrar or an ISP or a combination approach, because it's quite a difficult territory. Everything needs to be translated into Russian and notarized. So it's not an easy country. It's definitely the Wild East or the Wild West. Okay, so I mean, over to perhaps Paul for a comment on police and police involvement, because you might well be able to help with some insight on that. I know that was a question from Wendy Gonzalez here.
Yeah, look, I mean, I attend a sort of clandestine conference between law enforcement and industry on a regular basis. And look, there is a lot of success. I mean, I know it seems like we're fighting a battle that we can never win. And in some ways it's true. But, you know, for example, bulletproof hosting, for those of you who heard of bulletproof hosting, where, you know, I know you're laughing at David, but there were some good takedowns recently of bulletproof hosting providers. These are hosting providers who really don't care what's being hosted. So domains pointed to them can host all sorts of illicit content, but, you know, in areas such as the former Russian states, etc. So, you know, there is collaboration going on. And, you know, look, you can't go wrong with going to the police, at least trying. I'm not saying you'll get success, but you know, the more reports are made, I'd hope that, you know, more action could be taken. But I'm not entirely optimistic that would be entirely possible.
Yeah. So I think, as David, you pointed out, I mean, obviously, these are just, you know, short-term solutions. So that's why it's always important to consider all the available tools, because sometimes registrars respond, sometimes they don't. Sometimes ISP respond, sometimes they don't. Sometimes police may decide to help, but sometimes they don't. So I think, you know, you really need to do in-depth investigations to find out all the relevant facts of the case and to decide strategically what is actually the most useful strategy, because not every strategy is the same in every case. You know, even similarly with domain name disputes, we talked about that briefly just now. Usually it's very successful, but we've definitely come across cases where it's not successful. And in fact, there's a trend now called reverse domain name hijacking. So basically the infringing registrants of domain names, when you go and file a complaint against them, they might actually go back and sue you for this, you know, sue you for reverse hijacking. And so there are situations where we actually tell clients that it's better not to file a domain name dispute complaint, because it might actually backfire against you. I think particularly in situations where, as I mentioned, if the domain name registrant actually registered the domain name before you actually obtained clear rights, you know, it is actually quite difficult. It's not impossible, because there are situations where panels have accepted that you could have post-registration infringement or misrepresentations, but you do have to look at the facts very carefully before you decide whether or not to do that. There is quite a famous company called Telepathy Inc. They are quite a famous domain name dealer. They've registered hundreds and thousands of domain names, and you know, a lot of their names become infringing, but they have actually in the US taken legal court proceedings against people who file complaints against them under the US Anti-Cyber Squatting Consumer Protection Act. So he turns back to sue the complainants. So you do have to be a little bit careful. So they are becoming more and more sophisticated. Yeah.
That's a very interesting point, actually, Charmaine, and probably a good segue into a question that we've had that perhaps Kieran can help us with. So I think it's Neil B here has sent a question through that I mentioned UDRP but not URS, and does that mean that we think that URS has not met its expectations and hopes? I mean, yeah, we do use URS. It doesn't tend to be one of our preferred routes, but I wondered if, Kieran, if you've got any thoughts on URS as the expert on this panel on that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thank you to Neil for the question. I think our experience mirrors just what you've said, though, in fact, David. We have been offering that service for a while. I guess the first point to make is, as far as I understand it, it's limited to new GTLDs. Right. And so there's a bit of a narrowing of scope of when it can apply to begin with. Also, I would say, speaking to our experience, we've had I think it's three URS complaints filed, which then didn't proceed for the very reason that the scope they were being applied for in respect of domain names where the URS in fact doesn't apply. So I think there's probably a bit of limitation in scope, which results in a lack of engagement with that particular process. So we haven't certainly by any stretch seen that being actively used. And I also wonder, just a side point there, that I suppose the UDRP can work quite effectively. So if we look at 60 days being a maximum, and URS, I think the figure is about 40 days or slightly less. So there's not a huge difference either. But I think perhaps the scope is one of the reasons. But we certainly haven't seen many at all.
I think also for URS, I think the remedy is only for suspension, but not transfer.
Right.
So I think for a lot of brand owners, they actually want the domains transferred to them so that it would, you know, avoid other people taking up the domain again, right?
Yeah, that's a good point, Charmaine. And our preference is if it's a question of suspension, we're probably better off going to the registrar and doing a registrar takedown than necessarily going to URS. Thank you. So there was another question that came through. Are there instances where websites are being held legally responsible for the infringing sale of counterfeit items? And I think this is generally in relation to marketplaces, but also perhaps to e-commerce sites in general. So I'm going to provide a brief answer and then maybe pass it to Charmaine. You might be able to help further. But I certainly know that in China and in other parts of the world, there are new laws that service providers and online platforms are legally responsible, but they're legally responsible to have a process in place to monitor their websites and then also to respond to complaints from brand owners. But that also then puts an onus on brand owners to respond within a certain time frame, because if you don't respond, I think within 10 days, then that particular platform or marketplace is able to drop the case. So there is that. Also, there's the general feeling that, I mean, certainly we work a lot with all the different marketplaces. Their biggest fear is being sued by a brand owner. So they tend to be responsive when they are informed of an infringement. And to varying degrees, the platforms are trying to be as proactive as they can. So that I think that's the short answer. Charmaine, I don't know if you've got any points about the legal responsibility of platforms and e-commerce sites.
Sure, this is a timely question because just 2 days ago I received a court decision for one of the cases that we did for Taobao. So they're sued by a brand owner for products sold on the platform. And the court just issued a decision which confirmed the position in Hong Kong. Because I think generally around the world, the legal position is that, as you rightly mentioned, that with these marketplaces, because there's so many people posting products for sale on their platform, it's impossible for them to monitor. So they're not really held to be primarily the seller of these products. However, the general rule is that you must have a notice takedown procedure. And if you don't take down within a reasonable time after you've been noticed, then you could be held jointly liable for facilitating, authorizing, or joint tortfeasor, etc. So Hong Kong, was proposed some amendments to the law many years ago, but because of a lot of public objections, etc., the law never came into force. So it's never clear in Hong Kong what the position is. So this case, which just came out, it's Mary Case versus Taobao Alibaba, confirmed that the position is the same in Hong Kong in the sense that as a platform owner, even though you make money from the sales on your platform, because you are not actually the direct seller, you have no knowledge of what's being sold on your platform. So unless and until you've been notified of any infringing products, then you don't take it down, then you could have liability. But as long as you take it down within a reasonable time, then you wouldn't be held liable, even though you might be helping promote the products, or you are actually deriving financial gains from the sales. So that is the general position. Of course, there are exceptions where there are some websites which clearly is there to facilitate infringement. So there are cases around the world where the website is for downloading illegal movies, music, etc. And as a platform, it is still held to be liable because clearly they know that the entire platform is used for that purpose, and they have functions which help people locate the right movies and the films, etc. So whilst that's a general position, there are situations where even platforms and marketplaces could be held liable, depending on how much you actually know and how much you're actually involved.
Yeah, that's a great point, Charmaine. And the question of the case of movie downloads, there is something called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DMCA, which is a piece of legislation that people can use to go to those sites and ask them to take down content within 24 hours, or otherwise they'll be in breach of that particular law and they could be held liable. And there has been sort of numerous high-profile cases taking down those kind of download and file sharing sites. So I think we're
sorry, just to supplement,
yes.
I think as you also mentioned, a lot of platforms are actually doing a lot more to try to help the brand owners as well, because whilst they know that they might not be legally liable, but I think for the purpose of giving assurances to both brand owners as well as the customers, I think a lot of them are doing a lot of things to work with brand owners. So as brand owners, there's it's very worthwhile to cooperate with them and to join a lot of their brand owners programs, because it would really help to make it much easier to police what's on these marketplaces. Yeah.
That's a really good point, and we've I can sort of agree with that. So we've helped to facilitate some of the clients that we work with joining some of those brand owner programs, for instance, the Alibaba Group, etc. So just to finish off then, and I'll pass back to Kieran to wrap up, because we're sort of slightly over time now. The last question I'm going to address is, are organizations and companies doing enough to combat cyber threats? And I think generally the answer to that question is probably no, especially as it's getting more and more prevalent, especially over the last year with the global pandemic. So it's all about, it's a bit like an arms race, really. You need to make sure that the infringers are not sort of too many steps ahead of you. You need to make sure that you've got all the kind of tools and partners to help you capture the cyber threats before your consumers and your employees are impacted by some of the sort of threats that we've been discussing today. So anyway, I'll pass over back to Kieran to wrap up.
Can I just add quickly on that one?
Sorry.
Yeah, just very quickly. Sorry, I know we're out of time, but there are things companies can do, and I was sort of shaking my head because you're right. Most companies are woefully behind a bit on this. But one of the things is certainly to protect yourself from attacks using fraudulent domains. Look at the creation date of the domains. Fraudulent domains are generally created either in the month or two prior to the attack. They don't stay up very long. So block any domain that's created within, say, the last 6 months. Boom, you eliminate most of the threats. Nice and easy. Look at your subdomains. Subdomain attacks are growing, right? So if you've got an IT security team, talk to them. Do they understand this? Do they point subdomains to places like GitHub where they store code? Because we're seeing increasing numbers of takeovers of sites that are used briefly on GitHub and then closed off, but they haven't closed off the subdomain. So it still points to GitHub, and an attacker can create a new place to store malicious code. There's loads of things I can talk about on the security side, but we're out of time. Kieran, back to you.
Yeah, well, actually, Paul, just a quick note. If anyone also wants to try and trace the owner of a website and they can't get it from the current registration, if you look at some of the archive sites like there's archive.org and the Wayback Machine, they have the historical data for those websites, because after GDPR, a lot of the whois details have gone dark. And if you look at those historical sites, we find that often you've got real address details for the infringer before they decided to go criminal. So that's another tip. Anyway, sorry, back to you, Kieran.
Thank you very much. I think what this has shown us amongst many of the useful tips that you've shared is that there's a huge amount to talk about, and I think we were massively over optimistic with putting down a 30-minute panel discussion on this topic. So I think what it's taught us here is actually we could probably invite each of you back independently if you would have us and do a sort of individual session on your specific areas of expertise, because so much came out of that in terms of the different strategies and ways to address these issues. And given the huge amount of audience engagement, which I thank you all for, I think there's a lot more that needs to be discussed in this space. So I think we've probably provided what's a teaser, and I certainly wanted to hear a lot more from Paul, Charmaine and David. So thank you for participating, and I think we've got a lot of takeaways to build upon, and we can clearly see that there's a huge interest in this space given the increased relevance of it. A couple of housekeeping points, really, just to say that a few people have asked. We will be sharing the slides afterwards. We will be sharing the speaker's contact information. We've also shared it in the chat here, so feel free to reach out to them. A recording will also be shared, so you will have the relevant information hopefully at your fingertips. But we do hope to continue this dialogue here at HKIAC, and I just want to thank again Paul, Charmaine, and David for their contributions, and just simply to say that I certainly wanted to hear more from you, so I hope we're able to do this again very soon. But thank you again for your attendance, your engagement, and we look forward to another webinar soon. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.